Our sermon reading is a few lines from a great Supreme Court case called Schempp versus Abingdon Township in 1963. From the majority opinion, the wholesome neutrality of which this court's cases speak thus stems from a recognition of the teachings of history that powerful sects or groups might bring about a fusion of governmental and religious functions, or a concert of dependency of one upon the other, to the end that official support of the state or federal government would be placed behind the tenets of one or of all orthodoxies. This, the Establishment Clause prohibits. Our sermon hymn is number 176, Die Gedanken sind frei. It's 291, okay.
Yes, it is. It's in my draft. Thank you.
My apologies. This morning, one of my great lifetime heroes. When I first started working at the ACLU and reading constitutional law, I realized there's some people that are willing to stick their neck out for the sake of making law and challenging legal principles and seeing what's constitutional and what's not. And you often don't know that till you get to court. So, and thank you to David Reno for being persistent on getting this man here. And now I wish you would all welcome Mr. Ellery Schempp.
Like Ellery Schempp, I am from Pennsylvania, which was also the home of the Constitutional Convention that founded America. And I sort of did what Ben Franklin, one of my great heroes, did in reverse. He came from Boston and went to Philadelphia. I went from Pennsylvania to Boston. I would like to say that William Penn founded Pennsylvania and had believed in religious liberty so that it could have all sorts of people like Baptists, Jews, et cetera, and there would be no official test of official religion. And here, carrying on the tradition of Pennsylvania in its highest tradition, is a fellow Pennsylvanian, Ellery Schempp, PhD.
Well, thank you for that introduction and for inviting me here. You were sharp in remembering that June 17th was the 60th anniversary of the case called Abington versus Schempp. It also got attached to the name Murray versus Curlett. And I thank Gigi for arranging all the music for today. I wish to thank people who are not here today. Alan Gladhorn, my English teacher at Abington, and the ACLU attorneys, Henry Sawyer, who wrote the briefs and argued at the Supreme Court, and Spencer Cox and Bernie Wolfman, who are important people in the ACLU structure. And I remember the pioneers who went before me, Vashti McCullum in Illinois, Stephen Engel and Larry Roth in New York, and all those in the pioneering case of Engel versus Vitale in the decision of 1962. There's a wonderful phrase from the Engel decision: "It is no part of the business of government to be composing prayers." I want you to remember that phrase, because whenever the issues of religion and separation of church and state come up, you should remember the phrase, the business of government. Well, pioneering did not end with Abington. There were many future cases. Debbie Weissman here in Rhode Island, well, not here, but nearby, Alton Lemon in Philadelphia, and there is no time to mention all of them, but there are a dozen of cases that rose from the citizens who stood up. It's interesting that Pennsylvania has been described as Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between. Well, it was a long time ago. I was born in Philadelphia, and we moved to Roslyn, a part of Abington Township, when I was in second grade. And we lived at 2459 Susquehanna Road. That was the first word I learned how to spell. A few years ago, I revisited the old homestead with my brother and sister, and we received very kindly by the present owners. As we were leaving, I noticed that house number was 2461. What happened to 2459? Turns out there was so much mail still coming to the house even 30 years later, and the owner petitioned the town and the post office to renumber the block. So the house numbers now go from 2457 to 2461, and 2459 no longer exists. Well, the seeds of my protest had roots in several experiences. I loved science, and from second or third grade I was fascinated by the solar system and learned all the planets. The idea that the Earth was very old and that much had happened before we arrived made a deep impression on me. Dinosaurs were not a thing at that time, but they made more sense to me than the Noah's flood and giraffes. I was also an avid reader, which expanded in high school with readings and on democracy and social issues in a study group where I solidified my perspective on the separation of church and state. As we attended the Unitarian Church in Germantown, this was before the days of UUs, this was seminal. We learned about other religions, and I quickly assimilated the idea that there was no single religious truth. The Germantown Church was very special, but it had an interesting pulpit that included Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, and Norman Thomas. I was greatly enamored of Norman Thomas and his ideas of social justice and religious freedom, and he spoke with a ringing voice about the great problems of our time, and he wanted to rush to the barricades. For these reasons and more, I became involved in thinking about the Constitution and the Bible way back in 1956. I was a 16-year-old junior in Abington Senior High School, located in a suburb of Philadelphia. Pennsylvania had a law that required 10 verses of the Bible to be read in every classroom each day. This was followed by the students standing to recite the Lord's Prayer and the flag salute. It is interesting that this daily ceremony was known as morning devotions. 20 or 30 states had similar laws. Well, it seemed to me that this was a violation of the First Amendment because it clearly established a Christian religious practice in public schools under the authority of the government. I read the First Amendment several times. It is only 45 words long, and so not very taxing for teenagers. One morning, I brought to the Koran to read during morning devotions. I did this I remember this was the Monday after Thanksgiving break. I did this because I wanted to show that the Bible was not the only holy book. The Koran was merely an accident. One of my friend's fathers had a copy in his library. I didn't know anything about the Koran or Mohammedanism or Muslim religious faith at that time. Neither did anybody I knew. I was sent to the principal, who lectured me on respect and the school rules. I replied that I was concerned for respect for the Constitution and freedom of conscience. He sent me to the guidance counselor. Was I having problems at home or respect for authority? No, I said, I just disagreed with Bible reading and prayer. That evening, I wrote a letter to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union in Philadelphia, asking for their help. I typed this out with 2 fingers on my dad's typewriter. I was 16, remember? As gentlemen, it's November 26, 1956, gentlemen, as a student in my junior year at Abington Senior High School, I would very greatly appreciate any information that you might send regarding possible union action and/or aid in testing the constitutionality of Pennsylvania law, which arbitrarily and parenthtically and seemingly unrighteously and unconstitutionally compels the Bible to be read in our public school system. I thank you for any help you might offer in freeing American youth in Pennsylvania from this gross violation of their religious rights as guaranteed in the First and Foremost Amendment of our United States Constitution. Sincerely yours. Well, speaking for American youth was rather pretentious indeed. And since then, I learned to write shorter sentences. I also enclosed a $10 bill. That was about $100 in today, and this got their attention. If a kid can save this sum from his allowance, he must be serious. Well, going back to 1956, we were in the midst of the McCarthy era, when every dissent was labeled communist or worse. The 50s, when to conform was the greatest goal. But in the Supreme Court in 1954 had decided that segregation was a violation of the Constitution, and it was an affirmation of human rights and social justice. This influenced me to think that this applies to religious minorities, of which UUs are a member. In 1954, the phrase "under God" was added to the pledge. It's amazing, none of our founding fathers ever recited the Pledge of Allegiance, nor did Abraham Lincoln. It was written in 1896 by Francis Bellamy, a minister with socialist leanings, and was only widely used after World War I. When I hear that under God is essential to our well-being, I ask, how could it be that the United States survived for 100 years without this pledge? The phrase "under God" was added only in '54 at the urging of the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic group that favors Vatican-based government. The entire Congress marched out onto the Capitol steps to recite a new pledge while singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers." Well, from all this, you can see that the United States history and my history gave me 4 reasons for making my protest. Fairness. I thought schools needed to be fair to everyone. The Bible is not the holy book of Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims. Non-believers going to school to learn history and math should not have the Bible or prayer forced on them. I remember that my Jewish friends were made uncomfortable by certain passages, and Catholic kids did not say the same Lord's Prayer. There's a Douay version of the Bible. It contains different books and a different version of the 10 Commandments. It's interesting that the law in Pennsylvania spoke of the Holy Bible, but there in fact are maybe 30 different versions of the Bible, different translations used by different Protestant groups, and there's the Coptic Bible, and there's the Russian Orthodox Bible, and many, many other Bibles. So the idea that there's one holy Bible is ridiculous. So I saw that the school was a missionary for one sectarian belief and was trying to suppress other beliefs. It seemed to me obvious that the Bible is not a source of morality, as the school claimed. I knew that kids in Oregon and other states did not have Bible reading. Were they less moral than us in Abington? It was a very vexing question. The Bible contains passages that are in direct contradiction to science, such as Noah's flood. There are so many accounts of creation in various traditions, so the Genesis account and Noah's flood or myths are simply a couple among many others. Many of you may know the story of a woman who was asked, what holds up the earth? And she said it was held up on the back of an elephant. And what does the elephant stand on? The elephant stood on a rhinoceros. And she said, and so what does the rhinoceros stand on? And she said, a turtle. And so the man asked, what does a turtle stand on? Listen, Sonny, she said, it's turtles all the way down. Rituals imposed on children are an unfairness. In the Abington decision, the court recognized that children are particularly vulnerable and deserve particular protection for their developing thoughts as to their freedoms of beliefs. Without coercion from a dominant religious belief, being excused from class is not an effective answer. Self-identifying as a dissenter or non-believer opens the door to discrimination. Imagine a child has to stand up and identify his or herself and be noted by all the other students in the class, and this opens the door for bullying and retribution. One of the memorable phrases from the Abington decision, written by the Supreme Court, was written by, in this case, Tom Clark. Children are not noted for resistance to the forces of social suasion. It's a very important phrase when considering separation of church and state for kids. Well, the ACLU, after many months of discussion with our family and after much deliberation, agreed to provide legal support. We argued in court that the Bible reading was a violation of the First and the 14th Amendments. It's very important to know the 14th in this connection, because it is interpreted to mean that the Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment, applies to the states as well as to Congress. After hearing testimony in 1958, the district court agreed 3-0, that our understanding of the Constitution. The school district then appealed to the Supreme Court. A similar case was brought by Madeline Murray in Maryland in 1960. These two cases reached the Supreme Court at the same time and were joined, as I mentioned before. Murray founded the American Atheist and was featured on the cover of Life magazine as, quote, the most hated woman in America. In June of 1963, the Supreme Court issued their decision. It was an 8-1 decision. Imagine that in today's Supreme Court, 8-1. It ruled that Bible reading and prayers in the public schools violated our Constitution. This changed the laws in about 32 states. Bible reading as a devotional ceremonial practice stopped. This decision was joined in concurring opinions by both liberals and conservative justices, and by justices who were Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic. So this is very broadly based, not in any way judicial activism. Potter Stewart was the lone dissent. Well, the reaction, it made national news. There was outrage on a grand scale. You might say it was of biblical proportions. But President Kennedy made a nice statement to calm the country. He said, we can all do a little bit more praying at home. And there's a wonderful little cartoon that you can see that my partner Arlene has brought with us from the Washington Post, in which he shows an angry father sitting at the breakfast table shouting, what do they expect us to do? Pray at home? Well, Earl Warren was the Chief Justice at the time, and he just joined in the opinion. He was not the author. But he'd been the target of the John Birch Society for several years. And now billboards redoubled, impeach Earl Warren. We received about 5,000 letters, roughly 1/3 of them supporting us, 1/3 opposing in reasonable terms, and 1/3 hateful and threatening. Several of the letters in support mentioned the book in the Bible, actually, of Matthew chapter 6, which warns against praying for public display, as hypocrites do, and seeking public approval and not using vain repetitions. My parents answered every letter that had a return address. This was in the days before Xerox machines and when stamps cost 3 cents. It still came to hundreds of dollars. We were accused of being everything the writer hated. So we got these letters that said, what are you, commies? What are you, Nazis? What are you, Catholics? What are you, Jews? We didn't expect the ones that said, what are you, Presbyterians? In the name of Christ, go to hell. Some were newspaper pictures smeared with excrement. One of the things that we learned was that in the United States it was considered bad not to be Christian, but it was very, very bad to be communist. But it was really, really quite awful to be an atheist. When people called us, you communist atheists, they had reached their ultimate in outrage. Atheists are the most hated and feared group in America. And we have to remember that fear and hate go hand in hand. Fear is a primal emotion. Fears of many kinds can overtake us. Some are realistic, others are exaggerated. But when these brain centers are activated and the others stop working, so it is that religious demagogues appeal to our fear centers. Conspiracy nuts use this trick all the time. Our family suffered relatively little, especially in comparison to what the Murray family had to endure. Several times dog poo was thrown on our steps. Kids in school the school bus rolled down their windows and shouted, now passing the commie camp when passing our home. Both my brother Roger and my sister Donna were key to the Supreme Court case because they were still in school in 1963. I had graduated, so my name is not in the Supreme Court decision, except as a footnote. Both my brother and sister suffered taunting and ostracization. Donna is the youngest and had the toughest time. For many years, she was embarrassed to even mention the case. I'm glad to say that today she feels the case is important to our freedom and democracy. And Roger also suffered, but he had a deep appreciation of our case. Roger did a fantastic thing. He kept archives of newspaper accounts and the 5,000 letters we received. Some of Roger's archives are on display. It's a really wonderful record of the reactions from 60 years ago. Unfortunately, he died 2 years ago. I did not suffer any discrimination in high school. I learned later that my high school principal, Eugene Stull, sent letters of disrecommendation in all my college applications. The principal even went so far as to calling long distance, which was expensive and rare in 1958, to beg Tufts to rescind my admission, that I was a rotten apple and I would bring disrepute to Tufts. Dean Charlie Stearns at one time told me the story about how he got this the most amazing phone call they'd ever received was as he was working as an admission director. But Charlie Stearns was saying, Dean Stearns said that Tufts never regretted their decision. I was very happy to hear that. I could spend another hour on history, but I move on now to talk about the Bible and the Constitution. Many people assume there is some connection between the Bible and the Constitution. Let me tell you, there is nothing in the Constitution about the Bible, and there is nothing in the Bible about democracy or our Constitution. Our Constitution never once mentions God or Christianity or any commandments. It is a purely humanistic document. The preamble begins, as you know, we the people do ordain and establish. The Constitution mentions religion just twice, and both times the word no is attached. The first mention is in Article 6, no religious test shall ever be required. The second time is in the First Amendment, in the Bill of Rights. Congress will make no law, whatever. The Constitution is a purely humanistic, religiously neutral, secular, and political document. No delegate thought the idea of free voting by common people came from divine revelation. It is significant that the Constitution does not call for any worship or ask for any divine blessing. The Constitution's oath for taking office does not contain the phrase, so help me God. That has been appended by various oath takers, probably for political spin. Scholars think that Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison probably never used the phrase, so help me God. The writers of the Constitution were careful to distinguish between an oath versus an affirmation, because oath swearing had religious connotations. You remember, everybody knows the phrase, do you swear or affirm? It's interesting. Many people don't think about why that extra phrase, or affirm, was included in the oath of office or in the statements that people make. That's because that the idea of swearing was considered religious, and the idea of affirming was considered to be secular. So you did not have to have a religious thought or motivation to affirm. So the phrase to affirm was to assure freedom from religion. Well, and now let's think about the Bible, which never mentions democracy. It never mentions freedom of speech or freedom of religion. It does not mention checks and balances or limitations on the power of the executive, nor an independent judicial branch. It does not mention elections or voting. We are not a Christian nation. We are not a Judeo-Christian nation. We are a constitutional nation. And let me insert here about the Declaration of Independence. It is a poetic document intended to stir emotions and to override the prevalent notion of the divine right of kings. The Declaration of Independence is equally for religious independence and for political independence. But the main point here is that the Declaration of Independence is not any part of the Constitution and no part of our laws. Not a single legal decision by the Supreme Court or any other court is based on the Declaration. Secular means government works for the people without regard to faith. It means government is neutral with regard to private beliefs. Secular means neither pro-God beliefs nor anti-God. The alternative is a Christian or a Sharia-type government ruled by clerics. Our Constitution prohibits religious law. It is secular, and this is why separation of church and state is very important. Well, what is the state of our separation of church and state? There are constant displays of public piety, constant calls for some God to bless us and help us out. The Constitution was made for we the people, not for deities. It is up to us humans to cherish and defend it. So I leave here with 4 ideas that I leave with you. Nothing I ever did in my life was by me alone, and so it is for all of us. We gain our individual strengths from our collective strengths. Without the ACLU and my parents and teachers and friends, our family would not have accomplished the milestone that we remember here today. There really are only 4 forces in nature: gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. Spirituality is not one of them. The neat thing about science is that it works whether you believe in it or not. We have humanist and UU ethical values, and I celebrate these. And I have a rather simple faith. I believe in beauty. There is great beauty in our lives. And we should have a sense of humor about our existence. It surely is a funny thing that I'm here today. And lastly, and foremost, I think separation of government policies from religion is a beautiful idea. So I thank all of you for inviting me and making it possible for me to enjoy this beautiful morning with you all. I had planned on all of us singing the hymn, the song from George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. The things you're liable to read in the Bible are not necessarily so. But I understood that we couldn't do that for some reason. And so I ask you to go look it up. The things that it ain't necessarily so. The things we're liable to read in the Bible, they're not necessarily so. You'll find it very funny hymns. And I'll leave one with further thought. I mentioned earlier that the Engel decision in 1962 ended with the idea, with this phrase: "It is no part of the business of government to be composing prayers." And anytime the issue of separation of church comes up, you should ask the question, what is the business of government? Is the business of government to compose this prayer, to have this prayer? The business of government is a very critical idea to maintaining the separation of church and state. Thank you.
Let's now receive the offering for
You may write out a check to First Church Boston and mail it to 66 Marlborough Street, 02116. You can also donate via text. Simply text the dollar amount, 5, 10, 20, etc. to 617-917-5610. You'll receive confirmation by email. Thank you.
extinguish the chalice, I invite you to join me with the words in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. May the light around us guide our footsteps and hold us fast to the best and most righteous that we seek. May the darkness around us nurture our dreams and give us rest so that we may give ourselves to the work of our world. Let us seek to remember the wholeness of our lives, the weaving of light and shadow in this great and astonishing dance in which we move. Amen. Please be seated.
Live every Sunday at 66 Marlborough Street at the corner of Berkeley Street in Back Bay. If you would like more information about programs, services, or membership at First Church, please visit the website www.firstchurchboston.org or send an email to office@firstchurchboston.org.